Hi everyone, this is your first lecture, kind of an intro lecture that I'm going to present to you in child development. So I just wanted to take a few minutes and give sort of an overview about the topic of this class. You might hear child development thrown around a bit in reference to maybe how children think, maybe how their emotions develop. You might have heard terms such as self-soothe or emotion regulation. You might have heard terms such as problem solving and things like that. And all those terms that we hear when we're working with kids are in reference to child development. Um, so when I was working with kids, I remember hearing all these buzzwords and hearing all these things that had to do with kids. I remember one instance in particular where I was working in a toddler room and we had biters. We had kids who were biting each other. And I was pretty new to the field and I hadn't seen this before. And I thought, well, this is kind of, hard. What are we going to do about this? And I heard somebody say, hey, 2-year-olds, when they're biting each other, that's developmentally appropriate. And I thought, appropriate? Like, it's never appropriate for one kid to bite another kid. But what they meant was, it's appropriate because kids, when they're 1 and 2 years old and they're in care, and younger, obviously, but when they get teeth and they're young, they put things in their mouth. That's how they explore their world. That's how they figure out what's what. So they're meant to be putting things in their mouth. So in that way, it's appropriate. And that really sort of struck me. And it really sort of changed the way I thought about working with toddlers. And maybe some of you are already there and you've overcome this, and you've learned about this already. But for me, this was a very big deal. I was like, well, hey, I get it. These kids are putting things in their mouths because that's what they need to do. And they're biting their friends because that's what it feels like. They want to feel something in their mouth and they want to bite down. And then, of course, along with that, there's a whole lot of emotions that go along with it. I've got feelings and I don't know how to express them with words, so I'm going to express them with my teeth. That's just one simple example of child development as how it comes up in our work with children who are in our care. So I'll kind of go through like the theory of child development and what it all means, and hopefully we can sort of piece together why it's important for us to learn about child development as we work with young children. So, without further ado, why do we even want to study children? Do we even need to know about how kids develop in order to care for them? Well, yes and no. I'll kind of tell you what some reasons of why it's important to study children. For those of us who are going into child care service, it's important for us to understand what's appropriate for kids. So what's typical? What's a typical behavior for most children at certain ages? That might be because we want to figure out why a toddler in our classroom is biting. It also might be because we're trying to assess children and we want to find out if some of their behaviors are on par with their peers. So to be able to find out if there's some sort of a delay. So those of us in child care service need to know this kind of stuff. As well as those who are going into elementary education for similar reasons. It's important to know what's typical for a given age. That doesn't mean that there are no individual differences between children. That's not the case at all. But we do like to know what is sort of the norm, what is the typical way that, let's say, a first grader is able to write their name. We want to know, like, what do most first graders do and how does this first grader measure up? Are they a little bit ahead or are they a little bit behind? And are they so far behind that it's cause for concern, or are they so far behind that it's just within the normal range and it's totally cool? All right, it's also important to know for parenting. Those of you who might be parents are probably interested in understanding what different stages your kids go through at what ages. And I like to get a little bit lofty about this, you guys. I think it's really important to understand development because it helps us understand humanity. Children are human beings, and we were all children once. So in order to understand ourselves and understand the world around us, I think it's very important to understand the steps that we go through to get there, to think and to understand and to learn and to feel and to interact with the other human beings. I think it's important to understand the stages and the steps that got us from birth to wherever we are now, and our peers and so forth. Okay, so I'll give you kind of a textbook definition of child development here. Development is a pattern of change that begins at conception and continues through the human lifespan. So in our class, we are going to look at development from conception all the way through adolescence. Now, developmental science, of course, goes through old age and death, but we won't cover that in this class. And so all of this stuff is rooted in what's called a developmentalist perspective, and I'll get to that on the next slide, but the developmentalist perspective is, it has to do with a more holistic perspective than some other ways of thinking about children. The developmentalist perspective takes into account biological, socio-emotional, cognitive things. All those things kind of come together to make a child who they are. And so it's not just psychology, or it's not just environment, it's not just one thing, it's a holistic view. And so when I say developmentalist perspective, you could almost replace that with like a holistic perspective. Let's look at what that looks like on this next slide. So this is a Venn diagram that's from your textbook that looks at these three different areas of development. These are three ways that human beings develop. They develop biologically, they develop socio-emotionally, and they develop cognitively. Let's look at what each one of those mean. So biological processes are changes that happen in an individual's body. So some examples of that are growth. So you grow from short to tall. I have an infant baby right now, and she has her skull, you know how babies have a soft spot? It's slowly growing together. That's a biological process. Biological processes also include genetics, all the genetic things. So if you're genetically predisposed to have a short temper, that's a biological process. If you are genetically, you have a genetic code for blue eyes, then that's a biological process as well. And then we've also got cognitive processes, and these are changes in individuals' thought, there should be a T there, intelligence, and language. So this is, some examples of that are like thinking and learning, problem solving. Think about a kid when they're putting a puzzle together. They're figuring out where all the pieces go, they're figuring out how to turn a certain piece to get it a certain way. They're doing all that type of stuff. And well, I'll stop there. I'll just give you that. So there's problem solving, there's thinking, there's paying attention to stuff. So I'm focusing in on one thing and giving that sustained attention. So maybe what you're doing right now, paying attention to this lecture, if you're not scrolling around on your phone, put your phone down, close your Instagram, is you're paying attention to one thing, and that's a process that kids have to learn how to do. They have to learn how to focus attention on just one thing. And actually, I think it might be interesting to talk about in this class as well, maybe it'll come up in some discussions, how children's attention is changed by use of media. I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. And then finally, we have socio-emotional processes. So these are individuals' relationships with other people, changes in emotions, changes in personality. Now, this word, socio-emotional, sort of crams together social and emotional. And the reason why that's done is because there's a lot of overlap between those two. And you might sometimes hear just social development and just emotional development. And I am going to ask you to pull apart those two social and emotional development things in this class. But for this Venn diagram, we're going to think about it as sort of, there's so many interrelations between social and emotional, we'll smush them together. So some examples of that are your trust relationship that you build with a caregiver. So your caregiver responds to you in such a consistent way that you build a trust relationship. That could be a parent, that could be somebody who's taking care of you, like in a child care setting. You also, it has to do with emotional development. So that is the specific development of emotions. Infants are born with very basic emotions, just sort of comfort, discomfort, pleasure, displeasure. And then they evolve into more complex emotions like fear and guilt and shame and joy and generosity, like these kinds of things that you're not really able to tap into at an infant stage. This also has to do with the sense of self, so recognizing that you are an individual and that you have agency over your environment. So all of these three processes are influenced by your environment. So where a kid grows up, if they grow up in a big city, in a downtown high-rise apartment building, that's a particular environment. If they grow up on a farm, that's another kind of environment. If they grow up with a two-parent household versus a single mother or a grandmother who's raising them. All those are environmental factors, whether they grow up rich or they grow up poor. All these things are environmental contributions, and all that stuff influences biology, influences cognition, influences socio-emotional processes. So there's that influence. And then also, taking a look at that Venn diagram, I don't know if you can see my pointer on here, but notice all these overlaps in those three bubbles. These things aren't developing in isolation. No, no, no. They are influencing one another. So one thing I like to think about, one example that I always am drawn to is think about your biological process. So that might be motor development. Think about fine motor skills. That's using your fingers to articulate little things like picking up a pencil or threading beads on a string. Then think about cognitive processes where you're figuring out problems and the steps that you need to take in order to solve a problem. One thing I like to think about is when a kid learns to tie their shoes. They're using fine motor skills, but they're also using cognition because they need to know what are the steps to tie my shoe. You know, maybe you make two bunny ears and tie them together. Maybe you do the loop and swoop. Both of them involve a step-by-step process that you have to carry out, and you need the fine motor too. So that's one example of how biological and cognitive influence each other. And we're going to look at this quarter, we're going to look at how those overlaps happen, but I also want you to spend a lot of time pulling apart biological, cognitive, social, and emotional things. All right, so this is another image from your text that has to do with the different ages that we're going to be covering. And so we're going to look at prenatal, that's everything before birth. We'll look at infancy, and that in the developmental perspective is considered sort of everything from birth till like age 2.5. So that's kind of, a little bit of infancy. That's their definition. Early childhood will go from like 2.5 till about age 8. Middle and late childhood are from ages 8 till puberty. Sometimes people say age 8 to 14. And these are all rough ages, right? Because development, it varies. And then we'll also look a little bit at adolescence, which is from puberty all the way through the teen years. And in developmental science, we kind of sort of split hairs about what is adolescence. Is there early adolescence, late adolescence, early adulthood, late adulthood, but we'll just sort of call adolescence the teen years here in this class. And now I'll just give you a quick topical outline. This will be pretty brief. We're just sort of following the general outline that's from the textbook that you're using, the Rothhu's textbook. And so we'll kind of start with this background, history, theories, and methods. You guys will read about it, you'll talk about it, and we'll kind of look at the history of where it's from. And then we'll talk about early development. So we'll look at conception, prenatal development, and birth. A lot of this is going to be genetic stuff. This is a lot of the biological development stuff. And then after we cover those two things, we're really just going to go through the next 3 stages and look at those developmental domains. So we'll look at infancy and look at physical, cognitive, social, emotional, or biological development. Either or works. And then we'll do the same for early childhood. We'll look at physical or biological development, cognitive, social, emotional. Same thing for middle childhood. Look at the 3 areas. And then we'll also look at it for adolescence. Now, before we end, I just want to do a quick note. I'll go back to this slide. Let's just look at it here. So when we're thinking about these areas of development, the term that we use in developmental science is developmental domains. So if you're taking notes right now, write down developmental domains. That's what it's called. And you might have heard an acronym called PIES, P-I-E-S, which stands for physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. Both PIES and developmental domains are talking about the exact same thing. The difference that I would like you to pay attention to in this class is I just would like you to use the term developmental domains because it's a little bit more inclusive and it's a little bit more widely used. So thinking about our language is important. And now I'm just going to skip back to where we were and wrap it up with a beautiful kitten picture. You all have a great afternoon, and please enjoy the lecture. Let me know if you have any questions.